My name is John Passfield. The title of this reading will be Emily Bronte Video 5, The Reflective Journal. This is my novel, Emily Bronte, More Myself Than I, a novel by John Passfield, a picture by the historical Emily Bronte, a pen and ink drawing that she did of herself. With the face hidden, She's a very private person, and that's sort of the point I'm making here in these notes. In this video, I'm going to read from the journal which I wrote. We're writing the novel. The title of the journal is The Making of Emily Bronte, More Myself Than I. And it can be found and accessed for free on my website, John Passfield, small letters, all one word, .ca. The novel is 52,000 words, and the journal is 59,000 words, so about the same length. The journal records 3 months of reflection and assessment as I was polishing the rough draft. In this reading, I'm going to present 5 passages as a sample of what the Emily Bronte journal contains. So here's the first reading for today. I continued to make the occasional note on the topic of a Bronte sister novel, all 3 sisters as equal main characters, and to read about the sisters and their novels in my spare time. However, on Wednesday, May 27, 2015, I faced a dilemma in the planning of such a novel. It was that the lives of Charlotte and Anne Bronte were well enough documented, but there was little, almost nothing, about the life of Emily Bronte. This led me on a search of the Emily Bronte writings and biographies. If my novel was going to explore the image quarry from which Emily Bronte drew the imagery of her thoughts, what was I going to have available? Besides her novel, Wuthering Heights, her gondol poems, and a few anecdotes which illustrated how silent, alone, and unknown she was to those who spoke about her after her death. Even Charlotte found Emily to be much of a mystery. So, I would have a very intense main character with creative imagery from her writings, but a shortage of biographical information on which to draw in order to parallel her with her sisters as main characters. In short, the problem that I saw was that the most intense of the Brontes, Emily, would have to be presented without the biographical information, and hence the imagery of the intensity of her mind. So we know she thought intensely, but what did she think about other than Wuthering Heights and her poems? Number 2, I've come to think of the highest level of literature as exploring, above all, the topic of imagery as the language by which we do our thinking at the deepest level. Here, Kathy, the character Kathy in Wuthering Heights, is aware consciously of the imagery which is influencing her present actions and plans for the future, but often we are unaware of which categories of imagery, amid the welter of image systems with which we are bombarded from outside and which we generate from inside, are having great influence on our thoughts and our actions. This, I assume, was the great discovery of Freud, which he rightly attributes to the writings of the myth of antiquity. I have written about Una Ellis Fermer and her comments on the imagery of Shakespeare, in which she points out that the technical devices of poetic dialogue and the soliloquy allowed Shakespeare to deepen the realistic actions and speeches of his plays to include the imagery by which the characters were attempting to understand their own situations, their societies, and whatever cosmic forces were operating in, or whatever patterns were shaping the events of their lives. So trying to figure out how the imagery of this novel would work and where it would come from, too. 3, the third passage. On Thursday, May 11, 2017, after reading more about the Brontes, I brooded over the lack of information about both Emily and Anne Bronte, certainly when compared with the plethora of information about Charlotte Bronte. At that time, I was developing a theory that Emily and Anne had quiet lives, at least as they would appear from the outside, even to those who interacted with them on a daily basis. But Taking my cue from Charlotte's letters, Emily and Anne had very intense inner lives. The theory considered that, in lacking the more detailed and adventurous outer lives of such as their siblings, Branwell and Charlotte, Emily and Anne borrowed the imagery of the lives of those around them and thought with this imagery rather than with the imagery of their own lives. This is not so far-fetched as the four Bronte siblings thought with imagery that they borrowed from the life and writings of Byron, the literature of the Gothic writers and the Romantic writers such as Wordsworth and Coleridge, and with the imagery of the lives and thoughts of the characters in their own Angria and Gondel writings. I referred to this theory in my last written novel, Glenn Gould, Light and Dark. Well, I can't hold it up because it's not published yet, but it is complete and ready for publication, where a commentator compares Glenn Gould to Shakespeare, the quiet person in the public setting who leads a seemingly uneventful life and yet is more alive to the implications of the imagery of the lives of more outwardly passionate people than are Glenn Gould and Shakespeare themselves. So, I had Charlotte and Branwell Bronte with well-documented image quarries, and Emily and Anne Bronte with very little available image quarries, and a theory which showed me the way ahead. Incidentally, so fascinated was Shakespeare about the process of borrowed imagery and its advantages and disadvantages that he wrote a play in which Othello begins to think in imagery, which is borrowed from the mind of Iago. And that was number 3 of the passages I've chosen to read from the Bronte Journal. Here's number 4. It's interesting that from the outside, Emily Bronte resembles Ellen Dean as the character whose lifestyle is most like her own was at the time when she was writing Wuthering Heights. In fact, all 3 Bronte sisters took over much of the work of the family servant, Tabby Ackroyd, when Tabby became too ill to do her chores. Commentators have remarked that the portrait of the everyday work of a kitchen, a house, and a farm is realistically portrayed in Wuthering Heights, much of it in the words of Ellen Dean, the household servant at both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. I always had trouble with that, Thrushcross Grange. In fact, Ellen plays a number of roles in the novel. Number 1, she does the chores of both households. Number 2, she attempts to gain an understanding of the thoughts and actions of the people, the main characters of those households. 3, at times she influences the thoughts and actions of the main characters. 4, she narrates their story as best she can to an audience. So what do we make of this? That Emily Bronte equals Ellen Dean? That all 3 Bronte sisters equal Ellen Dean? Well, it's interesting that the friends of Charlotte all felt that Emily Bronte was an exceptional person. They all saw her as shy and non-social, and they all sensed an extra dimension in her thoughts beyond any conversational topics that might have been shared when they were in her presence. So what we have in Emily Bronte is a person who spends most of her time acting in the role of a family servant, baking bread and cleaning and minding the chores, and a lot of the time in private thought. She did not keep a journal. She wrote few letters. A possible second novel is not available to us. She wrote Wuthering Heights and a number of poems. Little of what she wrote is in the language of prose. The novel and poems are written in the language of imagery. Okay, here's the 5th passage that I've chosen from the Bronte Journal. That Cathy in Wuthering Heights is caught between Heathcliff as a force and Edgar as a force is quite understandable. It is Heathcliff who represents the person who is only subjected to one force for the whole of the story. It is Kathy who is appealed to by two forces, not only in life, but in death. We readers can attach labels such as faithful, oh, well, that'd be Heathcliff, and unfaithful, oh, Kathy. Or mature, Kathy, I guess, and immature, Heathcliff. But all we have in the novel Wuthering Heights is the imagery of the forces at work in the mind of Emily Bronte, and not the actual prose thoughts from which the imagery is derived. Of course, the two characters are presented in the novel as one soul which oscillates between unity and disunity. I saw the Bronte sisters as I was reading the biographies as having two worlds in which they were living, the real world of the parsonage and the ideal world of the writings, and of being realistic about the difficulties of attempting to unite the two. The Angria and Gondel worlds were not a fantasy of escape from the real world of the parsonage, but a set of standards in imagery which the Brontes simply applied to the real world without compromise. The inability to harmonize the two worlds destroyed Branwell Bronte. There is much speculation as to the amount of sympathy or disdain that each sister felt for him. It is interesting to consider that they all were subjected to the same forces in life and in their thoughts, and embodied those forces in the imagery of their works. I felt the effacing of self motif to be a key image for this novel, Emily Bronte, More Myself Than I, and it applies in various ways to all of the characters, both derived from historical people and from the novel Wuthering Heights. Well, those are the 5 passages that I chose to read for this video presentation. Here as a conclusion is something I thought of as I was looking over these passages. When the modernist novel was new in the 1920s, many readers found it hard to read. No doubt the modernist novel, though it's been around for 100 years, is difficult for many readers today. However, the modernist novel was not written to cater to the point of view of the reader, as was the case with prose novels up to that time, and continuing on, no doubt, to our own day. Rather than being written for the reader's point of view, the modernist novel was written from the main character's point of view. So although the reader is often confused while reading a modernist novel, the main character is not confused. The aim of the main character of the modernist novel is not to tell a story to a reader, but to review the events, either of his or her entire life, or of a recent experience that he or she has been through, or to review the events that he or she is going through at the present moment, in an attempt to see meaning in these experiences. So rather than review these events in the past tense, as has been done and still is being done in the prose novel, the main character, who knows the events of his or her life experiences as well as any narrator of a prose novel does, seeks, unlike the prose novel narrator, to achieve multiple perspectives on those events by rearranging the information of those events in a thematic order rather than in a narrative order. The main character of a modernist novel seeks multiple perspectives on significant events by turning the information of those events into imagery of varying intensities and angles. The modernist novel is not a failure to present the characters, settings, dialogues, and events clearly to a reader. It is a success at presenting the thinking process which all human beings undergo in the ink and paper form of the modernist novel. The Emily Bronte Journal can be accessed for free at my website, John Passfield, small letters, all one word, .ca. Thank you for watching this video.